All right, Jawosai, good morning, a good tavach, a great sukkos, Baruch Hashem. I know, it's great, by the way, such a good energy. Baruch Hashem, it was a great sukkos to be able to begin another week of Daf Yomi together. First of all, the haschala of the week, and a great opportunity also to give a special thank you to David Schwartz for always taking care of our coffee every single morning. To Rabbi Shalom Rosenblum, who is the supplier of our coffee, Baruch Hashem, each and every day, and tremendous caffeinated team that we have over here at Kanai Nahara, Baruch Hashem. So with that, I'm sorry? Nobody calls for the tea. It's true. There is tea. Is there tea? Okay, good. So I'll say so again. Thank you to the Chaver, Baruch Hashem. Just thank you to Moshe for always taking care of all of our technical issues and enabling our online Chaver to join us each and every day. Baruch Hashem. All right, with that, let's begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Cheshvan, Amalim Lutova, Stephen Terry Zinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinn Burim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Lebracha, on the occasion of his 20th yard site. Our Day of Learning sponsors, Alexander and Valentina Vase, in creation of the yard site of Valentina's brother, Aaron Davidovich, Aaron Ben Yitzchak. Zichron Lebracha. Our Daf Yomi sponsorship for today, anonymous sponsorship in the Schos, Soros Tovos, and the healthy mother and baby for Sarah Miriam Bas Shulamis Chana, as well as the Daf Yomi sponsorship by Yal and Sarah Steinberg in the schos of the continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, and for an ultimate refuah shalima. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slavin Ali, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Chol Yisrael. This Baruch Hashem shower down bracha, Shefam B'Soros Tovos upon Klal Yisrael this week and for many weeks to come. But so with that, let us begin. We have a really exciting daf ahead of us today. Really exciting. Today's daf is Memtes 49. We are picking up on Memches Amud Beis. Thank you to Rabbi Richter for giving shir yesterday. I know we got a little bit further towards the bottom of the daf. We're actually just going to back up a little bit, 6 lines up from the bottom. On Memches Amud Beis 48b, middle of the line, Ashkechan. It is the fourth to the last word on the line. So remember again, Abosai, on Friday, we have the great schos to begin the new parak of Ezu Makoman, and by the time, this is the guarantee, by the time we finish this parak, we are mamish going to be proficient in all areas of karbanos. Like proficiency in any subject, there are easier days, there are more difficult days, there are more enjoyable days, there are more taxing days, but one thing is clear, if we stay the path, if we remain committed, if we open our hearts, open our minds, open our neshamas, recognize that every single word is, as the Gemara told us, ikvasad de Mashiach, living in Messianic era, we will come out from this parak ridiculously enriched. So with that, let's go. Ashkechon shchita ba'ola lemitzvah. Kabbalah nami lemitzvah ashkechon. So the Gemara says as follows. At the end of the day, if I remember again, we've been going through this, we've only done one Mishnah so far in Ezu Makoman. So the Gemara says, here's what we've found so far. That there's an obligation to go ahead and shecht the Ola in the north. Rabbi say, remember again, I didn't take out the chart, but remember again, this is north, right? This side of the Mizbeach. Now, by the way, I didn't point this out on Friday, but I'll just mention it now. What exactly north is going to be subject of somewhat machlokes, right? Because on one, what does north include? Is north just literally, again, this strip opposite the, no, it's because I'm just using it for this, it's okay. Is it this strip opposite the Mizbeach, or does it extend back this way as well, right? All the way, let's say, up to the wall, up to the dividing wall over here between the Azara and the Kodesh. So again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. That's going to have a lot of ramifications because, for example, who is permitted to shech the carbon? Who's permitted? Anyone, even a Yisrael. Well, interestingly enough, a Yisrael, it would seem that a Yisrael is not really allowed to come over here. So we're going to discuss exactly the mechanics of all this. But again, for right now, we're just going to call it north. So what we know is it means obviously here. The shaila is, does it mean here? Does it mean here? So that's going to, again, remain to be seen. But again, for our purposes, let's just go with north right now. So Ashkechan, here's what we know. Shchita ba'ola l'mitzvah, Kabbalah nami l'mitzvah Ashkechan. So here's what I know. The mitzvah is to shecht the ola in the north of the Mizbeach. I also know Kabbalah, reception of the blood, is also done in the north. Shchita v'Kabbalah la'akev minalan. How do I know that it's not simply a mitzvah to remember, the lashon of mitzvah means this is something good to do, but if you didn't do it, it's fine. So I know that there is a mitzvah to shech the ola in the north and to do Kabbalah, reception of the blood in the north. How do I know that it's not just a mitzvah, but in fact, it's obligatory? And by the way, obligatory to the point that what? That if you didn't do it, then what? Then what? The carbon is invalid. So how do I know that it's not just something nice, but it's actually obligatory to the point that if you don't do it, the effectiveness of the carbon is undermined? It's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Here we go. So this is very interesting. A chatos, now, I don't know if we mentioned this on Friday or if Rabbi Richter mentioned it in yesterday's shir, but the concept of north, the concept of tzafon, that a carbon has to be shechted in the north, that is actually stated in the context of Ola. That's where it's stated. So the Gemara says everything else is learned out from Ola. So the Gemara says, watch this. Uma chatos haba mikoach Ola ma'akeves. So a chatos, right? A chatos also has an obligation of shchita and Kabbalah in the north. Where is chatos learned out from? Chatos is learned out from Ola. So if chatos, which is learned out from Ola, is ma'akev, yet we know by chatos, if you don't do shchita and Kabbalah in the north, ultimately the carbon is invalid. Ola shaba'a chatos mikocha eino din shema'akeves. So you hear the logic over here? If chatos, which is learned out from Ola, has to be shchita and Kabbalah in the north, and if you don't do so, the carbon is ineffective, then all the more so Ola, which is the source for the halacha, shchita and Kabbalah in the north is ma'akev. Solid. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe not. Malachatos shekin mechaperes achavi krisos. So the Gemara always pulls this card. It's interesting. Maybe chatos is different. Now, why would chatos be different? Because chatos is pretty powerful. What makes it so powerful? That it's mechaper and chavi krisos. Right? Remember, you know, both say, when do you bring a carbon chatos? A carbon chatos is brought for any infraction which, if done intentionally, would be chayiv kares, and then if you did it unintentionally, you bring a carbon chatos. So carbon chatos is different, even though you're right, it's derived from Ola, but it is a very powerful carbon in that it's mechaper for kares, bearing infractions. Maybe that makes it different. Therefore, the Gemara doesn't have a source. I'm Ravina. Shabbos says, so just you understand, the Gemara is asking a simple question. I know that by Ola, and Kabbalah has to be done in the north. Mitzvah. Ideally, it should be done. How do I know that it's not just a mitzvah, but rather what? It's ma'akev. It is an indispensable part of the carbonic process where if you omit it, the carbon is undermined. How do I know that? So attempt one, learn it out from chatos. Okay, that didn't work. I'm Ravina. This was really the kasha that Ravad Bar Abba had. Rabbi says, this is very interesting. Klum matzinu tafel chamer mina ikar. See, Rabbi say, here's the problem. So the Gemara just wanted to say, we'll learn out essentially a kal v'chomer of Ola from chatos. And essentially, if chatos is learned from Ola, and by chatos we know the halacha is that you must have shchita and Kabbalah in the north, then all the more so Ola, which is the source, is going to require shchita and Kabbalah in the north, la'akev. So we'll say, what was bothering Ravad Bar Abba? But then the Gemara said, well, no, because maybe chatos is more chamer, because chatos is mechaper and chavi krisos. So says Ravina, what was bothering Ravad Bar Abba is, how could it be that the tafel is more chamer than the ikar? Which is another way of saying, how could it be that the derivative is more chamer than the source? Right? Remember, we'll say, what's the source? What's the source? Ola. The derivative, chatos. So how could it be that chatos is more chamer than Ola? In other words, if you're going to tell me that chatos, you must have shchita, you must have Kabbalah in the north, then Allah has kama v'kama, you're going to require that for Ola as well. So yet the Gemara says, not so pashut. So Ravad Bar Abba is bothered by this. Klum matzinu, how could it be tafel chamer mina ikar? That the second, literally again, in this case, the derivative should be any more chamer than the source. We'll say, by the way, I'll just tell you, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in that statement as well. Life is all about determining what is the ikar and what is the tafel. What are the important things in life, and what are there are important things, and then there are unimportant things, and then there are things of secondary importance. And life is all about triaging these things. Because what often happens in life, we get so caught up in things that either are unimportant or less important. And as a result, we don't end up giving our attention to the really important things in life. And you could go through an entire lifetime of things like this. There are things I will say, there are things that are in life, if you're going to devote attention to something, it has to be important and it has to be important now. There are things that are important, but they're not important now. There are things that are unimportant and never important at all. And life is all about triaging these things. Because I will say, life is short. And it is so easy to get your attention hijacked by all the wrong things. So the Gemara says, how could it be klomatzinu tafel chamar mina ikar? How could it be that something of secondary importance is ultimately treated with greater intention or greater importance than the truly important things in life? Triage your life. Identify what's important. Spend the time, focus on the things that are important, and don't allow yourself to get hijacked by the tough, unimportant things in life. Is that true? In other words, sometimes the tafel can be more chamer than the ikr. Where do we see that? I say this is so interesting. Remember, what's bothering about Dabar Ava is how could it be that the tafel, in this case the tafel is the chatas, is more chamer than the ikr, which in this case is the ola. To which which is another way of saying, how could it be that the derivative is going to be more chamer than the source? To which the Gemara says, but I'll show you cases where that's true. Watch this. This is so interesting. 49a, Memtes Mandala. Vari Meiser, listen to this, Meiser Sheni. Excuse me. Meiser Sheni. Who eats Meiser Sheni? Who eats Meiser Sheni? Owner. Where do you eat it? Yerushalayim Mirakodesh. Shalayim Mirakodesh. It's yours to eat, but you have to eat in Yerushalayim. Now what happens if Allah Chalamaysa Baruch Hashem, you are blessed with an incredible bounty and you can't transport all of your produce to Yerushalayim? So what do? You could redeem the produce onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, and there you have to spend it on food. So watch this. V'hari meiser daha nifta. So listen to this. So meiser sheni produce itself can be redeemed. So I have a bushel of grain. I don't want to transport a bushel of grain to Yerushalayim. So instead, I'm going to redeem it for money. I'm going to bring the money, the coinage, ultimately against Yerushalayim. Yet v'ilu lakuach v'kesef meiser eno nifta. So listen to this. But yet, if I went ahead, so let's say I went to Yerushalayim, and now I bought for myself. Shawarma, okay, good, right? Looking for something a little classier, right? Like a cake of pressed figs. I don't know, that sounds very, very Talmudic, right? I bought for myself a cake of pressed figs. So now what happens? Now that becomes tummy. However it became tummy. You can't redeem that. The Gemara says, so we'll say, see something interesting? So Meiser Sheni produce itself, Meiser Sheni itself can be redeemed. Yet what? Food purchased with Meiser Sheni money can't be redeemed. So what is this an example of? The derivative is more chamer than the source. Right? So here the source, right? Meiser Sheni produce itself can be redeemed. Yet something bought with Meiser Sheni money cannot be redeemed. So what's going on over here? This time, here we go. Halakwach bekesef Meiser Shenitma yipti yipadeh. See, the Mishnah says as follows. I brought Meiser Sheni money to Yerushalayim, I bought food with it, and then it became Tameh. So Tanakama says, Yipada, it could be redeemed. Rabbi Huda Omer Nikaver. And Huda says, no, it must be buried. Can't be redeemed, it must be buried. So we'll say, so what is he saying? At least according to Rabbi Huda, the derivative, i.e. produce purchased with Meiser Sheni money, is treated more chamer ultimately again than the source than Meiser Sheni itself. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam lo alima kidusha se limitbas pidyone. It's different. I will say this is not a function of the derivative being more chamer than the source. In order for redemption to work, what has to happen is the kedusha has to be transferable. So when you have the source Meiser Sheni, that kedusha is transferable. Already, again, when you're transferring Meiser Sheni's sanctity onto money and then using that money to buy other food, that is derivative sanctity. So derivative sanctity is not going to be strong enough to be transferred onto something else. So it's not a pshat that the derivative is more chamer. It's a function of the way kedusha works. Derivative kedusha cannot be transferred. Only original kedusha can be transferred. So interesting, so interesting. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, "V'hari truma." What about truma? Sorry, Tmura. What about Tmura? We'll say, what's Tmura? Tmura means I designate an animal ultimately as a carbon, and then I decide to swap it out for something different. So what's the halacha? There's a penalty. The Torah says, V'hayau Tmura, so called the Hashem. Both animals ultimately become consecrated. So what about Tmura? Dilukachim lo cheli abamim. This is very interesting. So it's actually quite interesting. If you try to consecrate a bamum, right? I go over to an animal. I go to a sheep, and the sheep, I don't know, the sheep is missing a leg. So what's the halacha? And I say, Harezu Ola. What's the halacha? It doesn't work, right? Why not? Because you can't, because a Baal Mum cannot be consecrated ultimately again as a carbon. Yet, the Ilu Ihi Chayla. So this is very interesting. Yet, I will say, if you go ahead, it's very interesting. If you go ahead and you do that same thing with the Tmura. So watch this. Let's say I consecrate a sheep as an Ola, regular sheep, good. Then I come across another sheep missing a leg. I feel bad for it. I say, you know what, Shefala, you should be the Ola, right? You be the Ola. So what's the halacha? So I say, I'm swapping out the original sheep for the missing leg, for the amputee sheep. So what's the halacha? The amputee sheep becomes a Tmura. Rabbi said, now that's pretty shocking. Why? Because halacha l'maisa again, if I tried to consecrate that sheep from the beginning, then halacha l'maisa again, it wouldn't work. Yet, when I make the amputee sheep a tamura for the original sheep, it does work. So what does this sound like? This sounds like a case of the derivative being more chamer than the source. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, tamura mikoach kadshim asya. So this is fascinating. Listen to how fascinating this is. I'm going to tell you the difference. The difference is when you make a carbon, when you make an animal initially hekdish, so what is that animal, what is the status of that animal before its consecration? What is its status? It's chulin. So in order for kodesh to be chal on chulin, the animal must be a certain way, meaning it can't be without mum. Otherwise, the hekdish, the kodesh designation doesn't vest. What's Tamura? Tamura is you're playing around with something that is already kodesh. Once something is already kodesh, the ability then for that status to devolve upon other things becomes easier. You hear this distinction? In order to go ahead and lift something up from chulin to kodesh, that's a much heavier lift. Therefore, the designation could only apply if the animal is fully fit and intact. Once the animal is kodesh already, it is much easier for that kedusha to spread to other things, even if technically they themselves are not fit. So therefore, again, if I have my sheep and my sheep is already kodesh, and then I go over to the sheep missing leg and I say, you're going to be the Ola instead of this one, since I'm already dealing with something that is kodesh, it is easier for that status to spread to something else, as opposed to making something chulin into something kodesh. Incredible. So it's not the pshat that the derivative is more chamer than the source. It's just a different functionality of the concept of hekdesh, which I will say, by the way, is also a tremendous Moser Haskell. If you think about this in just a moment, what's the hardest thing in life? The hardest thing in life is getting yourself from chulin to hekdesh. That's the biggest lift, right? Going from someone who is fundamentally mundane, ultimately again to someone who is holy. That's the hardest lift in life. But once I'm able to do that, and I'm able to say that I live in the realm of kedusha, then even again, if not everything is perfect, right? This is missing a leg, this is missing of this is missing of that, the kedusha status could spread. Once I'm able to make the lift from chulin, I'm able to make the lift on myself from chulin to kodesh. I don't need to be perfect. I just need to get myself into the realm of being kadosh, of being holy. Because once holiness has been created, it's able to devolve even upon a whole variety of imperfect circumstances. Such an incredible thing. So what about Pesach? What about Pesach? So listen to this. Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach itself does not require smicha, does not require nesachim, libations, does not require a waving of the chest and the thigh. Yet, v'ilu mosar didei taun smicha unisachim utnufas chazei v'shor. Now what's the Mosar? Remember again, classic case. Designated a carbon Pesach. And then what happened? I lost my carbon. So what did I do? I designated another one. I offered up the replacement, and then after I offered up the replacement, what do I find? My original carbon Pesach. So we'll say, so now the halacha is that carbon Pesach is offered up, or that original carbon is offered up, and when it's offered up with smicha, nisachim, and chazei v'shog. What is that an example of? That apparently the derivative is even more chamer than the source. Because now again, my original carbon Pesach did not need any of these things. Now this item needs all these. And the Gemara says, no, that's not a good raya. Pesach b'shar yimos hashana shlamim hu. That's different because again, remember, a Pesach during the rest of the year is called what? A shlamim. And stam shlamim requires smicha, right? Tznisachim and chazei v'shog. So therefore, that's not really a raya. Good. So we'll say, so that this is kind of where the Gemara stops, right? So remember again, let's go back for a second because we kind of got into a little bit of a tangent. What was our original question? Here's what we know. Based on our journey in Ezo Mekalman, what I know is as follows. I know that an Ola requires Shchita and Kabbalah in the north, right? What don't I know? Now I know that's the mitzvah, but Ula came along and what was Ula looking for? Ula ultimately again, the Gemara says, I'm sorry, the Ola, by Ola we're looking to understand ultimately again, is it ma'akev? Is it ma'akev? So the Gemara wanted to say, yeah, you can learn that from Chatos. So then this kind of sent us into a little bit of a tangent because the Gemara said, obviously, if by Chatos it requires Safan, it requires north by Shchita and Kabbalah, and Chatos is a derivative, ultimately again, of Ola. So the derivative can't be any more Chamer than the source. So that opened up this whole discussion where the Gemara was trying to show different examples of where the derivative was more Chamer than the source, but ultimately, again, it turned out that no, each of those things really has their own explanation. So now we're kind of circling back. Ibais Ema. So we'll say, so now we're coming full circle. Maybe, remember, we're still looking for the same source. What are we looking for? How do I know that Ola requires Shchita and Kabbalah in the north? And not just as a mitzvah, not just as something ideally that I should do, but it's ma'akev. If you don't have it, the carbon is invalidated. How do I know that? The Gemara says, Ibais Ema. Amekra, ha'ola bimkoma tehei. So we'll say the pasuk uses lashon of ha'ola. Now that ha'ola ultimately again is. They'll say, by the way, the chevra in the tanning section over here. If you want, I'm saying if you want, I mean, good. I mean, it's beautiful, by the way. It's just like such a this is going to go in our marketing, right? Right. This is what that Yomi does to you. Mamish, it comes from the Gemara, right? So, but if you want, cover there's Mamish an open table over here if you need. So Gemara says as follows. Ibay say the possibility is as follows. Amar Kra, the pasuk says ha'ola, the ola. So we'll say, so the ola, the Gemara understands, bimkoma tehei, which means the ola has to be offered up in a particular way. Interesting. So we'll say, by the way, that's that definitive article, that hey hayidiyah, right, which goes there and just says not stamol, but again, whatever we're talking about is definitive. Therefore, again, we're learning out from there that halacha l'maisa has to be in saf. And the Gemara says, fine. So we'll say, interestingly enough, that seems to be the end of the discussion. Right? Interesting. That's just ha'ola, the ola must be done in a particular way. What's the way the ola must be done? Shchita, Kabbalah in the north. Done. Next. Asham minalan, Dubai Safan. How do I know that Asham also requires Shchita in the north? Beautiful. Easy enough. Pasuk says, it's great. I will say, you know what's incredible? About learning Gemara? You learn how much is actually written in the Chumash that we just never pay attention to, right? Like Gemara says, hey, by the way, guys, it's a pasuk. Right? Okay, good. Wherever you shech the ola, that's ultimately again where you should shech the asham. Therefore, once we've established that ha'ola says that shchita is done in the north, so too asham is done in the north. Ashkechan shchita. Kabbalah minalan. So now I know that Asham gets Shchita in the north. How do I know that by Kabbalah it also has to be done in the north? The Gemara says, Ve'es damo yizrak. Because the pasuk says, and you shall literally again sprinkle or throw its blood. So from here we see that Kabbalah is also done in the north. Kibol damo nami b'tzafan. Ultimately, again, Kabbalah is also done in the north. Now the Gemara now asks an interesting follow-up question. Mekabel atzmo minalan. Minalan. So Rabbi says, so how do I know? Interestingly enough, so now by Asham I know Shechita has to be done in the north, Kabbalah has to be done in the north. How do I know that the person doing the Kabbalah also has to be standing in the north? So Rabbi says, it's actually an interesting connection over here. Like in other words, maybe the person, the Kohen, could be standing anywhere as long as he actually does the act of Kabbalah in the north. How do I know that the Makabel, the Kohen doing the Kabbalah, he himself had to be standing in the north as well? Minalan, Damo, v'es Damo. Okay, so both says, so Damo teaches me ultimately that Kabbalah itself has to be done in the north, and v'es Damo teaches me that the Makabel, the one ultimately again doing the Kabbalah, has to be standing in the north as well. Incredible. Ashkechan mitzvah. So both say, all of this tells me that by Asham, so I need Shechita, Kabbalah, and the person doing the Kabbalah, everything has to be in the north. That's the mitzvah. How do I know that it's not just la mitzvah, but la'akev milan? How do I know that halacha l'maisa, that this is an indispensable necessity? And if I'm missing it, the effectiveness of the carbon is undermined. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, there's another pasuk. What does the pasuk say? V'shachat es akeves. The pasuk says again, "V'shachat es hakeves b'mkoma sheyishchat es hachatos v'esola." So Rabbi say there's a repetitive pasuk. There's a repetitive pasuk. V'shachat es hakeves. Now, Rabbi say if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says it over here. V'shachat es hakeves is about 12 lines up from the bottom. V'shachat es hakeves. Rashi says ba'asham mitzora. Rabbi say this is talking about a different asham, the asham of the mitzora. So he says ksiv shana hakasav alav la'akev. So Rabbi say that is a repetitive pasuk, that a repetitive phrase mentioned by the Asham Mitzora. So the repetition tells me that what? That not only is Shechita b'tzafon, Kabbalah b'tzafon, l'mitzvah, but it's la'akev. You must have it. The repetition teaches me that it is an indispensable part of the Kabbanic process. Incredible, incredible. So repetition by Asham Mitzora teaches me again that by all Ashamos, you must have Shechita and Kabbalah in the north. I will say, is this not absolutely incredible? Isn't it absolutely? Just look what's happening over here. We're getting into the kishkas, the mechanics. We've done Ola, now we're up to Asham, going into Asham Mitzora. Listen to this. The Gemara says, 1 second. Bahai, lahach yuda asa. Now 1 second. Is that pasuk by Asham Mitzora? Is that why it's there? In other words, it's there to be repetitive and tell me that both Shechita and Kabbalah has to be done in the north la'akev. Is that what it's teaching me? Gemara says, 1 second. Here we go. It's here to teach you another rule. They both say, what's the rule? Actually, an interesting exegetical rule. Davar shahaya bichlal, something that was included in a general rule. V'yatza ladun b'davar achadash, and then it was singled out for some type of unique halacha. You cannot return it to the general framework until the Torah itself actually and explicitly returns it to the general framework. Now, where do we see that? Ketzad. Gemara gives an example of this. Ketzad. V'shachat es hakeves b'makom sheyishchat es hachatos v'esa ola b'makom hakodesh ki kechatos ha'ashamu. So as I said, the Gemara actually quotes this pasuk. This is by Asham Mitzora. Then what does the pasuk say? V'shachat es hakeves. You will shech the sheep. B'makom sheyishchat es hachatos on the same place where you shech the chatos and ola. B'makom hakodesh, in a holy place, ki kechatas ha'ashamu. Because ultimately, again, the asham itself is like a chatos. Now, what does that mean? She'ei tamud lomar ki chatas ha'asham. So the Torah did not need to say that the asham is going to be treated like a chatos. Ma tamud lomar ki chatas ha'asham. Why did the Torah say ki chatas ha'asham? Listen to this. Lefi sheyatza asham betzora lidon b'davar ha'chadash. So they say on one hand, an Asham Mitzora is in the Asham family, yet an Asham Mitzora is dramatically, fundamentally, and holistically different. Why? Because in Asham Mitzora you do something with it that you don't do with any other carbon. And what is that? Bebohan yad, bohan regel, ba'ozen yamanis. Interestingly enough, you take from the blood of the Asham Mitzora, what do? You apply it to say on the right big toe, the right earlobe, and the right thumb of the Mitzora. Of the person with tzaras. So therefore, I say, I would have thought, Yachol lo yehei ton matan daman ve'mor legab mizbeach. I might have thought that since this unique asham has blood applications, literally again on the Mitzor himself, I would have thought that what? That perhaps that tells you that there are no blood applications on the mizbeach for this particular carbon. Talmud lomar kichatas ha'asham. Therefore, the pasuk says, no, it's kichata. Asham is like a chatos. Ma chatos tu'una matan dam ve'mur legam mizbeach. Just like the chatos requires blood applications and sacrificial parts of the mizbeach. Af asham mitzora ta'un matan dam ve'mur legam mizbeach. So too, the asham mitzora requires blood applications and sacrificial parts on the mizbeach. Incredible. So watch just what happened over here. Right? So let's take a step back for just a second. We were talking about before. The Gemara is asking now, how do I know that Asham ultimately again has to be done in the north? Right? How do I know that Shechita is done in the north, that Kabbalah is done in the north? Okay, so the Gemara quoted Psukim. The Gemara said, fine, I know that that's La Mitzvah, ideally. How do I know that it's Le'ikuva, that it's an indispensable reality, that it's Ma'akev? How do I know that? I'm going to stop translating Ma'akev because you know what it means, right? Ma'akev means indispensable part of carbonic process, which if omitted, fundamentally undermines the effectiveness of the carbon. A very long definition for one word, right? But again, that's Ma'akev. So how do I know that it's Ma'akev? So the Gemara quotes the pasuk ultimately again from the Shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat. So remember again, ultimately, the Gemara quotes the pasuk about Asham Mitzora. V'shachat es hakeves. So the Gemara says it's redundant. It's redundant. So because it's redundant, it teaches you that the need for the north is ma'akev. The Gemara says, hold up. It's not redundant. It's not redundant. That's actually necessary for a whole other teaching. What is it necessary for? Because like this pasuk is on Asham of Mitzora. An Asham Mitzora is fundamentally different. Why? Because it has blood applications on a person. We don't find any other carbon like that, right? It's blood applications literally again, well, there are by the Nazir also has this, right? But Lamaisa, there's no other carbon like this. So I might have thought that since the Asham Mitzora has blood applications on a person, there's no blood applications or sacrificial parts on the Mizbeach. Therefore, what does the pasuk do? V'shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatas es ha'makom hakodesh ki kechatas ha'asham. Teach me that what? That even though Asham Mitzora was removed from the general framework of Asham, the Torah goes ahead and puts it back. So the pasuk is not redundant. The pasuk is not spontaneous. The pasuk is fundamentally necessary to teach me a separate halacha. Right? So I will say. So by the way, if that's the case, then what? Then the problem is we're back to square one with Asham. How do I know that halacha l'maisa? Ultimately, again, the need for tzafon by Asham is ma'akev. Pasuk is used for something else. To which the Gemara says you're right. But imkain nichtov b'hai v'lo nichtov b'hai. So the Gemara says just write it over here by Asham Mitzora, and don't write it by a general Asham. And I would write, and I will say again, then I would have said, if halacha l'maisa, again, it's true by Asham Mitzora, then obviously, again, it's true by regular Asham as well. Sahanicha isviralan yatzalida medavra chadash. So we'll see, now watch this. Now the Gemara is we're going to get like a little bit technical, like exegetically technical. So the Gemara says, isviralan yatzalidon medavra chadash. That when something generally, again, introduces a novel ruling, ihu de lo gamar michlalo. That is the item then that is removed from the general framework. Aval amud beis, aval klolo gamar minei. But the general framework, right? The items included in the general framework could still learn out concepts from the novel idea. Therefore, again, the Gemara says Shapir. Ela isvirlan delohu gamar michlalo. But if halacha l'maisa we say that ultimately, again, not only can the novel idea not learn out derivative ideas from the general framework, but the general framework cannot learn out ideas from the novel idea, then ultimately, again, the pasuk has to teach this halacha. To which the Gemara says, "Kevin da ahadre ahadre." No, because we'll say, remember again, what happened over here? So remember, something really fascinating occurred over here. We have a general concept of asham. Then the Torah introduces us to the concept of Asham Mitzora, which is unique. Why is it unique? Blood applications on a person, right? It's unique. Then what does the Torah do? The Torah goes out of its way to say Kechatas ha'asham, and saying that this Asham is just like every other Chatas and Asham. So what does the Torah do? The Torah takes Asham Mitzora and restores it back into the general framework of Asham. Beautiful. Once that happens, then all is good, and now we have the ability to learn out concepts from each other. Amar leimar zotra bereid Rav Mari, bereid Rav Mari Ravina. Ema, why don't we say ki ahadre kra legabe matan daman ve'imurin debaikuna? Maybe when the Torah restores Asham Mitzora, back into the normative framework of asham, what is it restored for? Blood applications. Blood applications. To say that halacha l'maisa, it requires blood applications ultimately again by kohanim. Aval shchita delo baiku nalomi bait safan. But maybe not. Maybe when it restores asham and sorah back into the framework, again, I will say maybe it only restores it for the framework for things that require kohanim. For example, like blood applications. But for shchita, that does not require a kohen, maybe halacha l'maisa again, asham and sorah is not restored. Maybe asham and sorah doesn't require shchita in the north. Imkain nemakra ki kechatos. Then just say that asham and sorah is like a chatos. My kechatas ha'asham. What does it mean when it says kechatas ha'asham? Kishar ashamos yihya. Ultimately, again, telling you that asham and sorah ultimately again should be like regular ashamos. And just like a regular asham ultimately again requires what? Shchita and Kabbalah in the north, so too asham and sorah requires shchita and Kabbalah in the north. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, Lama lilak, so just a little bit now, we're just kind of a little bit hung up on asham and sorah. Lama lilak shuye lechatos. Lama lilak shuye leola. But I will say, but why the need to compare asham and sorah both to chatas and to ola, right? The pasuk compares both of them. Why the need? Amravina, itzrech. I'll tell you why. You need both of them. I akshe lechatas v'lo akshe leola. If the Torah would have compared chatas ha'asham, asham and sorah to a chatas and not to an ola, havamina chatas mehechalam. I would have said like this. Where is chatas learned out from? Right? Again, I will say, at least when it comes to the halachos of Tzafan, of north, where is chatas learned out from? Ola. So the Gemara says, and therefore I would say, watch this. And it must be very important. I would have said, davar halamid behekish, chozru malamid behekish. So I will say, now watch this. If the Torah would have just said that ultimately, again, the asham and sorah is like the chatas. Where is chatas learned out from? Chatas learned out from Ola. In that case, what's happening over here? Chatas, which is learned out from Ola, now I'm going to go ahead and learn out asham and sorah from chatas. That would seem to solidify a particular principle, which is a subject of dispute, which is davar halamed behekesh, chozur malamed behekesh. If something that itself is learned out from a comparison to something, could it then be the source of a comparison to something else? So to illustrate this, if chatas is learned out from ola, can chatas then serve as the source for asham and sorah? So if the pasuk would have just written chatas, I would have said the answer to that question is yes, because chatas is serving as the source for asham and sorah that it requires north. Well, chatas is learned out ola, and therefore again chatas is now serving as the source for asham and sorah. That teaches me that something that is learned out from a hekesh, from a comparison, can then serve as the source for another comparison. And as we're going to see, not everyone agrees with that principle. Amalei Mar Zutra. And therefore, again, what does the Torah do? The Torah puts in there Ola. Ola also, so therefore, again, I'm actually not learning out Asham and Sorah from Chatas. Rather, I can learn out Asham and Sorah from Ola. Amalei Mar Zutra, Ravina, V'nikshe la'Ola, v'lo nikshe l'Chatas. If that's the case, then just let the pasuk say that Asham and Sorah is like Ola, and then don't bring in Chatas at all. Havamina, I would have said like this. I would have said, if it would have just said that, I would have said, Davar halami behekesh, chozur malami behekesh. Sorry, I would have said, Davar halami behekesh, chozur malami behekesh. The Gemara says, I would have said once again, that perhaps based on this we could say that something learned out from a comparison can serve as a source to another comparison. V'chitema nikshe akushe lachatos. Ultimately, again, then I would say, compare it ultimately again to chatos. Nechale demakish le'ikar. Ultimately, again, it's better to learn out Asham and Sorah from the source, which is Ola, and not to learn out from the derivative or from the Hakish, which is Chatos. Lahachi akshe lechatos va'akshe la'ola. Therefore, again, the Torah goes ahead and compares it both to Chatos and to Ola to teach me what Lamemar, Davar halamid behakish. Therefore, ultimately, again, the Torah comes along and tells me, adds in Ola over to teach me that we don't necessarily say that something itself that's learned out from a Hakish can be the source for another Hakish. Okay? Rava says, Rava says, ultimately, again, we learn out from here. Now, Abba said the Hacha over here is going to be, as we're going to in just a moment, Par Kohen Gadol. Parsha Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says, Dichsiv, Kasher Yuram Mizevach Hashlamim. So we'll say the pasuk in its entirety is Kasher Yura Mizerach Hashlamim Viktir Makoim Al Mizbach HaOla. So the pasuk, so literally translated, as you will, Yuram means like to lift up or to separate, as you will lift up or separate from Shar Zevach Hashlamim, just like the sacrificial parts, are lifted up from the Shar Zevach Hashlamim, Viktiram HaKoyel Mizbach HaOlah, and ultimately it will be burned on the Mizbach HaOlah, on the Mizbeach. So this is the Par Kohen Gadol, the part of the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, now, interestingly enough, what's happening over here? The Torah is comparing the par of the Kohen Gadol, ultimately again to, remember again, we'll say, what's the par Kohen Gadol? There's par Helam Davar Min HaTzibur, and there's par Kohen Gadol. This is if the Kohen Gadol offers an erroneous ruling. Ultimately, again, and the ruling is acted upon, he brings this unique carbon. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the Torah equates the par Kohen Gadol with a shlamim. So why? The Gemara says, Ilio Saras HaKaved Ulishtei HaKlayos. Say if it's to tell me about, say that's what? That ultimately, again, that the diaphragm, the liver, and the kidneys have to be offered up on the Mizbeach, the Gufei Ksiv. That's explicitly written in the Pasuk. That's explicitly, Gemara says, Amrapap Mishun the boy Agmure Yosar Sakaved Ushtea Klayos Mipar Helam Davar Shal Tzibor L'Siire Avodas Kochavim. Gemara says, listen to this. This is actually for a different reason. Mishum the boy Agmure Yosar Sakaved Ushtea Klayos Mipar Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. The Gemara says, the Gemara wanted to say like this, because we actually want to be able to learn out the obligation to offer up the diaphragm, the liver, and the kidneys of par helam davar mitzibor, and to learn out from Seiri Avodas Kochavim bigufei lo ksiv, because and to learn out from Seiri Avodas Kochavim, where it's not explicitly said, Omi par koin Mashiach hu degamer, and we're going to learn everything out from par koin Mashiach. So both I say, interestingly enough, we're going to learn out from par koin Mashiach, where it said explicitly that you have to offer up these sacrificial parts. Then I'm going to learn out ultimately again from there to par halam davar min hatzibor, and from there to sira avodas kochavim lahachi itzterich kasher yuram. Therefore, I need the phrase kasher yuram. Because once I have that phrase, ultimately again it's as if the obligation was written explicitly. And therefore I will say, because that phrase is there, it's not like I'm taking something that itself is learned from by comparison and ultimately using it as the source of a comparison for something else. Okay? Let the Torah just write it there. You don't need a hakish at all. Because if it had written in the actual pasuk itself, and I didn't need a hakish, I would have said, bless you, davar halamid behakish, chozer umulamid behakish. That generally something that is learned out through a comparison can serve as the source for another comparison. And you would say, go forward with that. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, since, let me just read it again. Torah could have written it in the actual source itself. Since it's going to be used as the source of a hekish, therefore the Torah writes in that context. To teach me ultimately something that is the source ultimately of a hekish cannot serve as the source for something else. So both say, let's zoom out over here for just a moment. So let's remember what we have, right? So what have we accomplished? What we've accomplished is, number one, we've solidified by Ola, right? Ola, Shchita B'tzafan, Kabbalah B'tzafan, not just for mitzvah, but Ma'akev. Next, Asham, Shchita B'tzafan, Kabbalah B'tzafan, Ma'akev, right? So now we've knocked off Ola and Asham. Both require Shchita and Kabbalah in the north, and ultimately not just required little mitzvah, but it's ma'akiv. If you don't have it, the carbon is fundamentally invalid. We also dabbled a little bit in Asham Mitzorah, right? Asham Mitzorah is one of these unique cases where on one hand it was part of the framework of Asham, but then it was removed. Why was it removed? Why was it removed? Because it's unique. What makes it unique? What makes it unique? Blood applications on people, or on non-people, on the Mitzorah. But yet, what does the Torah do? The Torah then puts it right back, ultimately again, in the context of Asham, by comparing it to a Chatas and an Ola, right? Puts it back into the category of Asham, to say that Allah says, as much as there are blood applications on a person, you also still require blood applications ultimately again on the Mizbeach as well. So it was taken out, then it was put back in. This then launched into a whole other discussion because interestingly enough, the Torah equates the Asham Mitzorah both to the Chatas and to the Asham. So the Gemara is trying to understand why. This then went ahead and opened the door to the following conversation. Davar halamed behekesh, chozer umalamed behekesh. If something itself is learned out from, so I'll give you an example. If B, right, if B, item B, right, topic B, is learned out, its halachos are derived from a comparison to A. Could B then serve as the source to allow C to learn out halachos from B, right? So that's another way of saying, say davar halamed behekesh, something learned out from hekesh, chozer u'la behekesh. Shabbos say, so now we see, by the way, that's a machlokes. That's a machlokes. And that kind of was just blown open in this last discussion over here. So let's go weiter. We have a few more minutes. Let's go just a little bit weiter. So the Gemara says, davar halamed behekesh, ein chozer u'la behekesh. So the Gemara now says, the truth is, in reality, the halacha is, or the definitive statement of those we subject to dispute as well, davar halamed behekesh, something learned out by comparison to something else. So again, B is learned out by comparing it to A. So now then you can't learn out anything about C from B. Which I will say, by the way, what's the logic in that? What's the logic in that? Because B itself is not a source item. B can't be a source item because whatever we know about B is derived from a different source item from A. So if B itself is not a source item, but B is learned out from a comparison with A, how could B be a source for C? Right, so the Gemara makes a statement. So therefore, Torah lame behekesh, eino chozer behekesh. Therefore, something learned out from a comparison cannot be the source to learn out something else. The Gemara says, where do we know this from? Imi de Rava, imi de Ravina. Either we learn out from Rava, and Abbas Rashi points out in the first wide line over here. Rashi says, imi de Rava, mi kasher yuram. He quoted the pasuk kasher yuram. Imi de Ravina, me asha metzora. Okay, so either from one of those two earlier sources which we learned, the Gemara says, imi de Ravina, davar halami behekesh, ma'u sheyelami b'gzera shava. Oh, interesting. Okay, so now let's take it for granted that we're going to paskin davar halami behekesh, eino chozer umalamed behekesh. Something learned out from a comparison cannot serve as the source for another comparison. But what about, let's say again, I learned out B from A through a hekesh. Could B engaged in a gzera shava with ultimately again C? Now let's remember again, how do you make a gzera shava? Similar word or phrase in two contexts. So I understand that B can't serve as a hekesh for C, but can it serve as part of a gzera shava for C? So Tashma, Boss raises this kash, a very interesting Tashma. Rabbi Nassan ben Avtul Mus Omer. Listen to very interesting. Minayin lepricha bebegadim shehi Torah. How do I know Bosai? Now that if saras erupts on an entire beged, which means you have an entire article of clothing that is covered by saras. How do I know that ultimately, again, that article of clothing is tahar? It's tahar. The Gemara says, how do I know this? So the Gemara says, Rashi points out there, second one line in Rashi, the pricha, in parchat saras b'chala beged. Literally, again, the saras erupted on the entire beged. How do I know that if you have complete saras on a beged, that the beged is tar? Ne'emar karachas v'gabachas b'vigadim. Torah use lashon of karachas and gabachas, that lashon by clothing. First white line, v'ne'emar karachas v'gabachas b'adam. Second white line, then Tesla and it says karachas and gabachas by a person. Ma lahalon parach b'kulo tar. So both say, just like by a person, what happens if a person is totally covered in saras? What happens? What's the halacha? They're tar. One of these unique, peculiar halachas by saras, right? You have a spot of taras, you can become tamei, but you're covered head to toe by saras. Ultimately, again, you're tar. So just like it says karachas and gabachas by a person, right? And a person covered head to toe by saras ultimately is tar. Afkan, so too by a beged, where you also have the same lashon of karachas and gabachas. If the beged is fully covered by saras, tar. Incredible. Now the Gemara says, watch this, Abosai. V'hasam. Minalan, how do you know by a person if he's covered head to toe, ultimately again by saras, that halacha l'maisa again is tar, tichsiv mirosho vi'ad raglov, because the pasuk says ultimately again from his head to his toes, right? The pasuk is v'im paruach tifrach hazaras ba'ar v'kissa taras or anego mirosho vi'ad raglov. Torah says if he's covered from his head to his feet, right? He's tar. Listen to this. Get ready, both sides. The iskish rosh l'regel, rosh l'regel, and we compare ultimately again the head of the metzora to the foot of the metzora. Ma lahalon kulo hafach lavan parach ma lahalon hafach lav. Sorry, ma lahalon kulo hafach lavan. Parach bekulo tahar, just like over there, right? If the whole thing turns white, tzaras erupts everywhere, ultimately is tahar. Afkan, so to kan, I will say, refers to the scalp. So to by the scalp, kulo hafach lavan, parach bekulo tahar. So I will say, so incredible. What is that? What did we just see over there? That's a hekish. That's a hekish, followed by a gzeir shava. A hekish followed by a gzeir shava. Rabbi Yochanan. In general, I'm going to say, so first of all, that seems to answer our question that even if you hold davar halamed behekish, eino chozer melamed behekish, there's something ultimately, again, learned out from a hekish, cannot serve as a source hekish for something else. Apparently, we hold that davar halamed behekish, chozer melamed begzeir shava. Right? Something out from a hekish, ultimately, again, it can be the source of a gzeir shava. And where do we just learn that out from? From saras. That's incredible. Incredible. We just saw about Saras. Gemara says, by the way, hold up. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, I think actually, guys, we're wrong. He says, B'chal Torah kula l'meidin lamad milamed. In general, both say it's not true. In general, in the Torah, you could always learn out something, even if it's learned out from another exegetical principle, which is another way of saying, just because B is learned out by a hekish from A, doesn't mean B can't be the source of a hekish for C. I will say this is very important, right? Zone back in now for those of you who are on vacation, right? I will say, so on my side, this is now, right? Tune in, right? So I will say because now, this is now principle, right? This is now principle. The Gemara says, in reality, just because something's been learned from a hekish, it serves as a source. That's the general kala Torah kula. So even if B, I'm just going to use the ABC model, just because B has been learned out by a hekish from A, B could still serve as part of a hekish for C. And just like again, you can make a gzeir shava between B and C. All of that works. All of that works. The only place, interestingly enough, where it won't work is chutz min hakodshim. Fascinating. The only place where this does not work, ultimately, again, is by karbanos, is by kodshim. She'ein danin lamad milamed. By kodshim, Abba is the exception. By kodshim, halacha lamaisa, by kodshim is the only place where if something is learned out through, if something is a derivative, it cannot serve as the source for something else. So in kodshim, in karbanos, sacrificial law, ultimately, again, if you're learning out B from A, so ultimately, again, then B cannot be the source for C, neither through a hekish nor even through a gzeir shava. It's not going to work. Why? He says, it's a very simple reason. Now, it's a little bit backwards, but he says, I'll tell you why. Dim kain lo yomar tzafona ba'asham v'tisi b'gzeir shava dekache kadasham echatos. Because at the end of the day, then the Torah would not need to say tzafon, would not need to create a north requirement by asham, and I could have learned it out from a gzeir shava of kache kadasham from chatos. So which the Gemara says, lav l'meimra, the davar halamin behekish ein chos malan b'gzeir shava. And therefore, I'll say, based on this, by the way, you have to say by kodshim, even, we'd have to say that even something not from a hekish, not only can that serve as another hekish for other items, but even can serve as a source for a gzeir shava. The Dilma, Mishum De'ikal Mifrach, maybe it's different there because I will say at the end of the day that Gzeir Shava ultimately would have a problem. Why? Malachatos Shekin Mechaparas Achabe Krisos. No, because maybe the Gzeir Shava wouldn't work. Why? Because you could ask a Piracha, because at the end of the day by Chatos is Mechaper an Chabe Krisos. Maybe that makes it more chamer. To which the Gemara says, no. Kache kadoshim yiserik sivi. There's another pasuk. So because there's an open pasuk, ultimately again the gzeir shava is free and clear. So Rabbi say, what do you see from here? What's the bottom line takeaway from the Gemara? See, interestingly enough, we went through this exhaustive exercise about davar halamid mehekish, chozer malad behekish. Right? If B is learned out from A, could B then serve as a source for C? And Rabbi say that question is on two levels. Could B, if B was learned out from a hekish, so could B serve as a hekish for C, or could B serve as part of a gzeir shava with C? So originally we thought the answer to that was no, yes, machlokes. Bottom line, the Gemara says, in kala Torah kula, the answer is yes. Yes, if B is learned out from A, right, through a hekish, B can serve as a hekesh to C or as a gzeira shava to C. That's not a problem. There's only one area where we say that if something is a derivative law, it cannot serve as a source for something else, which is kachim. Kachim. And I will say, where does the Gemara glean that from? The simple amount of repetition that keeps happening again by kachim. The fact that the Torah says something, reinforces it, says it again, indicates to us that in the realm of sacrificial law, we say davar halamid behekesh, something learned out from a hekesh cannot serve as the source of hekesh for something else, and quite potentially can't even serve as part of a gzeira shava for something else as well. But that's a din by kachim, not a din by anything else. Rabosai, shkoyach. What a daf, what a daf, what a day. Beginning of a great week together. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chavran Zoom. Jerry, the dining room is great, but I much prefer the rooftop. All right, get to tomorrow. All right, Chavran, Chavran, Baltimore, Chavran. Have a wonderful day, everyone.